Good evening, everyone. I'm Freddie ADELMAN, and I have the honor and the privilege to direct Smithsonian Associates. We are the world's largest museum-based education program, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you, our very valued members, our donors, and an equally warm welcome to those of you who are joining us tonight for the very first time. We're excited to have viewers from all over the country join us here as part of this evening's Smithsonian Associates streaming event. And although we may be gathering together from different places, we acknowledge that here in the United States, we all stand on native land in a country that is still shaped by a history of slavery and a legacy of racism. Gratefully recognize those who've come before us and those who continue to fight injustice today. It's particularly apt that this evening's program takes place as we close the day in honor of the legacy of one of the most revered American warriors against injustice, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Director Sam Pollard's MLK FBI was hailed by A.O. Scott in Friday's New York Times as an exemplary historical documentary, unafraid of moral judgment, but also attentive to the fine grain of ambiguity that clings to the facts. Doesn't force the preoccupations of the present onto the past, but rather invites you to think about how what happened then might help explain where we are now. The story took place a long time ago, but it isn't finished. It's also appropriate that this film marks the first streaming program of the History Film Forum, a project of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, with which we are proud to partner this evening. The forum was established in 2015 to explore issues related to history on the screen and in film as public history. Or to paraphrase A.O. Scott, to use film to help us think about the past and contextualize the present. With MLK FBI, we have a rich and insightful new documentary with which to launch those explorations. Before we turn to Director Sam Pollard and our panelists, I'm pleased to introduce my friend and Smithsonian colleague, Dr. ANTHEA M. HARTIG, the Elizabeth MACMILLAN Director of the National Museum of American History. ANTHEA?
Thank you so much, Freddie. My deep thanks to you and your great team. I'm also grateful for my staff at the National Museum of American History, our board of advisors, our generous donors, and you, the American people, throughout these United States and territories that sustain the public-private partnership that is the Smithsonian Institution. I'm honored to be here tonight as we revitalize the History Film Forum. And one of the key avenues, of course, into how we understand history is through the remarkable contributions of documentary filmmakers partnering with activists themselves and, of course, with historians to bring to life such compelling and important stories. This program connects us to our 40-year history of collecting stories and objects around the United States Civil Rights Movement. Former museum scholar, intrepid artist, and fearless activist Bernice Johnson Reagan began the Smithsonian's commemoration of Dr. Martin Luther King's birth more than 4 decades ago, and did so by making a fascinating choice. Our Martin Luther King program would not be focused solely on Dr. King. Dr. Reagan wanted the way we remember the freedom struggle to reflect its identity as she knew it as a participant and as a history that she would uncover as a scholar and a curator. She wanted it to be the people's movement that it was. It was a movement that ordinary Americans put their bodies and souls and hearts on the line to non-violently force the nation to live up to its stated ideals. I'm very grateful to Dr. Reagan, to her legacy, including one of her proteges, Chris Wilson, from whom you'll hear in a minute. This theme of the people's movement is one we'll return to tonight as we discuss this brilliant new film by esteemed filmmaker Sam Pollard. We start, of course, with the story of Dr. King and the government's effort to silence him and destroy the movement by discrediting him. And then we turn to a story of how the rank and file, the movement's foot soldiers, underwent the same pressures. On this year's celebration of the sacrifices and the achievements of the civil rights movement, at a time in our history that is so relevant and challenging, where we feel both the peril and the promise of our nation very vividly. This story offers us a pathway to inspire us forward as we work to build a more compassionate future, while at the same time, we recognize the enormous challenges we face to take on this work in goodwill. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, and I'm going to hand you back to my dear friend, Freddie.
Thank you, Anthea, for helping us contextualize the film forum within the National Museum of American History, and especially Dr. Reagan, who is a towering force. But before we get to the real meat of the conversation, let me just make sure that everybody has knows how to operate Zoom. I know we've been doing it now for several months, but let me just make sure that your experience on Zoom with us tonight is as best as it can be. So first, make sure you know where the chat box is. That's where we will be posting links to American history, to the Smithsonian Associates, to other relevant information that comes up throughout the course of the evening. When you have a question, and I know you'll have many, please post those in the Q&A box. For those of you who are joining us tonight on Ustream, there is a place for you to ask your questions, and we will move those over into Q&A and we'll forward them as well. I hope we get a chance to address as many questions as possible. We'll go by themes. And now, I expect that the program will last about an hour, but please stay with us for the whole time. The next two things, the CC closed captioning, we're delighted to be able to provide captioning for you, but if that's not something you appreciate, no problem, just click on it and you can turn that caption off, or if you prefer to add it, you can do that, toggle between them all evening long. And finally, we are going to have a survey at the end. We read everything, we really do. We look for ways to make these programs even better. Your advice, your suggestions, we take those to heart. So please take a moment to fill out the survey. And now, please welcome my friend and colleague, the curator of the History Film Forum, the executive director responsible for making that possible, the National Museum of American History's own Chris Wilson. Chris?
Thank you, Freddie, and thank you, Anthea. So pleased to be partnering with the Smithsonian Associates to bring to you these monthly online History Film Forum programs. And I want to thank Dan Minat and Democracy Films for their support in helping us make this happen. This is the first of many of these discussions where we'll be looking at film as a way of learning, interpreting, teaching, and understanding history. And so please take a look at, and keep up to date with the Smithsonian Associates website, also historyfilmforum.si.edu for upcoming programs in this series. I was really happy to work with our partners at the National Endowment for the Humanities, people from PBS, a number of filmmakers in developing the original in-person history film forums that took place at the National Museum of American History. We explored again how film is one of the most important ways that we look at and understand history, and that so many people take it in. And that goes for narrative films, for television, but especially, and I think our heart and soul of these programs was documentary films. So we're really happy to be starting this program with a look at MLK FBI, obviously a really relevant film today, and a film that so masterfully tells this story and takes us back to a time when we looked at the civil rights movement. We as a nation looked at the civil rights movement and its leaders and its foot soldiers as very differently than we do today. Our guests tonight are filmmaker Sam Pollard, and then we will switch to bringing in an activist, Larry Rubin, who will tell the story, as Dr. Hartig said at the beginning of this. We'll tell the story of the movement from the ground up, from the story of a people's movement, which is the way that we were all trained by the glorious Dr. Regan to look at that history. Sam Pollard, I'm going to bring in now. Sam Pollard is a veteran editor, producer, and director, and is among cinema's most dedicated chroniclers of the Black experience in America, moving freely across films and long-form television, as well as narrative and documentary films for the past 4 decades. He was one of the directors of Eyes on the Prize, which was really got me into public history, and along with, I think, the Ken Burns Civil War film of a few years before that. Sam has collaborated with Henry Hampton on Eyes on the Prize, Spike Lee, as well as producing many of his own documentaries on complicated American figures and the extended aftershocks of racial inequality. Sam continues to create films that are notable for their journalistic thoroughness and their cogent structure. Pollard also, it's fitting for us to be starting these History Film Forum programs with Sam, because he, the last time he was at the Smithsonian was for the 2017 History Film Forum, where he was both a keynote interviewee related to his film with Doug Blackman, Slavery by Another Name, which looked at the re-enslavement of Black Americans that was taking place through mass incarceration. And Sam also was a featured speaker at our Emerging Filmmakers Lab. And I want to talk with Sam some tonight about his beginnings as a filmmaker and those who mentored him, as well as his deep belief that he needs to mentor that next generation. So I'd like to bring on camera now and have us joined by Sam Pollard.
Chris.
Sam, welcome, and thank you so much for meeting with us today. I know you've been very, very busy. Your film has gotten a lot of press as it warrants, and I know you've had a very busy day with interviews, so thank you for taking the time to meet with us today.
My pleasure, Chris. I would not have said no to you.
So Sam, you've explored the civil rights movement many times throughout your career, again, from working on that classic Eyes on the Prize series to your films like Slavery by Another Name, to your work with Spike Lee on both his narrative films like Clockers and Jungle Fever and Bamboozled, to also his documentaries, When the Levees Broke, and documentary about the murder of the 4 girls in Birmingham. When you embark on a civil rights project, what goals do you have in mind, and what do you want the audience to take away with them?
You know, Chris, the first goal is to try to make sure you find people who can tell you the story, who live the experience, if possible, because that's always important. Because, you know, I like to not use narration in these documentaries, so I like to really get first-person narratives. And then the second thing is, after you've found the people that you think can tell these stories who had first-person narratives, you want to go and do kind of the research, what I call the archival research, the historic research, to make sure you're crossing all your T's and dotting all your I's, to make sure you try to tell a story as honestly and as truthfully as possible. And then the third thing is, you know, after working on so many of these films over the years, I just feel it's important that as an African American, we tell our stories and people understand our stories are also American history. That's a very important thing. Something I was sort of taught by from St. Claiborne, the late documentary filmmaker. You know, so those are the 3 things I'm trying to do when I make a film.
Great. Well, let's talk a little bit about a filmmaking question. You mentioned that you didn't want to have talking heads on camera in this film. You really wanted the story to speak in a different way. Tell us about that filmmaking choice in this film.
Well, you know, when Ben Hadeen, the producer of this film, and I started talking about executing this film, trying to raise the funds to make this film happen, one of the first things I said to him is, you know, we should try to do it without having anybody on camera, because the normal trope is to have archival footage and people come on camera. Go back to footage and stills and people come on camera. This time I wanted to try to do without that. And a film that had influenced that approach was a film I had seen in 2011 called Black Power Mixtape. And it was done by a Swedish documentarian that looked at the 70s. And what I found fascinating about that film was that all this fantastic footage completely engaged me. And the people who talked about that period, be it Harry Belafonte or Angela Davis, they were all voiceover. So it was such an impressive experience. I felt like I wanted to do that for this film.
So getting right into the history here, you said, first of all, that one of the things that drew you to telling this story was looking at a time when an icon like Dr. King was not an icon, was looked on as a pariah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, you know, it's fascinating. Now that in retrospect, we all seem to think that Dr. King was this deity that everybody just loved and worshiped. But as you dig into this history, you realize that to many people, primarily most white Americans, he was seen as a radical. He was seen as someone who was trying to upend their notion of American democracy, where we as Black people have been on the fringes of society for many, many years because of Jim Crowism. So they didn't think there was any, white people didn't think there was any racial problems. Sure, we had to sit in the back of the bus in the South. Sure, we couldn't drink at the white water fountain. We couldn't use the white bathroom. We had to use the colored bathroom and the colored water fountain. But that was just something that was the way it was. So why are Black people feeling upset? Why do they want to change? Why do they want to all of a sudden become a part of the mainstream? And here comes a gentleman who leads the Montgomery bus boycott in '56. And he basically says with his cohorts, we want to become a part of the American mainstream. It's time to integrate America. It's time to give Black people the right to vote in the South. And that really unnerved a lot of people, man. That really made people frightened, because they said, uh-oh, America's not going to be the same. And as we all know, that was one long struggle for King, Ralph Abernathy, C.T. Vivian, Dorothy Cotton, Y.T. Walker, and so many others, to fight the good fight for African Americans.
So when you're looking at it in an icon like that, and it's a history that people, I think when we look back at the time, everyone thinks, well, I would have been on the right side of history. I would have agreed with that. But when you look at polls, for instance, from the time period, that isn't borne out. We see this all the time at the Smithsonian with some of our mythic and iconic objects like the Greensboro lunch counter. Of course, everyone thinks I would have been part of that movement. But when you look at what people really felt about King and the movement, you see something very different in the early '60s and even through the end of the '60s.
Well, the thing to remember, Chris, is that lots of people supported the ideas that King were espousing, but they didn't want to get on the front lines. I think it's a misnomer to think that millions of Black people all of a sudden rose up and said, we're going to walk and we're going to picket, we're going to do sit-ins and stuff. No, it was a small group of people, Black people, who were dedicated to making change. So when you see those young people sitting at those lunch counters, that was a small group of people. When you see the young people in Birmingham, King was worried about getting the older Black people out there in Birmingham. He had James Bevel turn and bring out the young people. So you see it's young people out there who are being hosed and attacked by dogs. So, it wasn't like the large population of Black people. It was always a select few. But the thing we always should take away from this is that as much as we admire Dr. King, Chris, it was also his foot soldiers. It was the people, the local people in these local communities who said, we're going to stand up and fight back, fight back in nonviolent ways, So we need to remember that,
So take us to 1963. So there's a moment in the film where you focus on the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Of course, we always remember the freedom part. We don't necessarily remember the jobs part.
Right, we don't.
The sort of frightening, as you say, radical questions that were being asked by not just Dr. King, but other people on that stage. But we look at that, when we think about that moment of the I Have a Dream speech, for instance, we think this is another moment that all of us could get behind and should get behind. But and when you look at polls at that time, people were fairly that was about as popular as King got during the 60s. But something very different was happening at the FBI at the end of that speech. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, at the end of that speech, William Sullivan, J. Edgar Hoover, this is what they said. Dr. Martin Luther King is the most dangerous Negro in America. Dangerous. And that meant that he had to be monitored, because if he could get this group of people to come to the Lincoln Memorial with this "I Have a Dream" speech, what could he do? What else might he do in America? He might get millions of people in the cities to strike, to push back on the unlawful laws that were in the governments, these different governments. So that really frightened him, that he could have such a galvanizing impact. So they had already gotten permission from Bobby Kennedy to monitor other associates of King, because they had thought he was connected, he was flirting with communism because of his relationship with Stanley Levinson, a former communist. But after this speech, they went all out to get King. They started to they were wiretapping, they were bugging his hotel rooms and those of his associates to find out anything that they thought connected King to communism. But in wiretapping King, all of a sudden they learned what? They learned that this Christian minister who was second in command at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, who was married to Coretta Scott King and had these lovely children, also was a man who was involved in these illicit affairs with other women when he was on the road. And all of a sudden, J. Edgar Hoover and his close lieutenant, William Sullivan, had what I call this aha moment. And that aha moment was, if we can't get King, because of his connection with communism, we can use his illicit affairs as a way to destroy, dethrone, really destroy his reputation. Mm-hmm. And they recorded as much as they could about King and whatever affairs he was having, with the hope that they could then pass it on to the press, and that the press would publish and print all these things that they had gotten down on tape. But J. Edgar Hoover didn't take into account that in the 60s, the American press didn't dig into people's personal lives like we do today. They didn't want to know about the dark secrets of people like King or JFK. So they would not publish it, they would not print it, which really upset Hoover and his associates. So what did they do? They then went so far as to have Sullivan create a letter that was supposed to be from a Black person or a Negro to basically say, we know who you are, we know what you're doing, and you know what you have to do, which from my perspective intimated that Dr. King should think about killing himself. Then they sent that letter to Coretta Scott King, and they sent an audio tape that was supposed to be King in his situation with another woman, also to Coretta Scott King. So if they couldn't, destroy him politically, they wanted to hopefully destroy his marriage, but that didn't work, so, and that was illegal. What they were doing was illegal. That wasn't part of their mandate as FBI agents.
And we should say that these documents began to emerge and become public in 2017, 2018, were reported and written about by David Garrow, who is is presented in the film, a longtime biographer of King, but who has really started focusing on this material. We again should say that the tapes of that we're talking about that these were based on are not yet public and won't be for some time. So all we have is these written field reports by agents. You asked Garrow in the film what, and I want to get back to the communist part of this in a minute, but what is the responsibility of a historian working with this material, which you point out in the film is flawed in many different ways because of the bias that the agents have, and because, you know, they were talking about things that were visual, but they couldn't see anything. There were, you know, these were bugs and so forth. So what is your responsibility in you know, dealing with this sort of material?
Well, here's a couple of things. First of all, you know, I knew David Garrow from before this book because he had been one of our major consultants on Eyes on the Prize. And, you know, he won the Pulitzer for writing Bearing the Cross about King and the SCLC, you know. So when David came out with these articles about the revelations about the supposed rape allegations, as you know, Chris, there were lots of people in the community, Black historians and others, who were very upset with David. So after that, you know, we had reached out to David. Before that, we had reached out to David and we had decided we were going to make a film from his book. So we optioned his book. We flew out to Pittsburgh, where David lives. We spent 4 hours with David, basically having him give us all the information about the genesis of the book, the information in the book. And, you know, we thought this was going to be and it became the frame for the film. Now, after he wrote those articles about the supposed rape allegations, where King was obviously supposedly in the room while this other minister was raping this woman, we went back to Garrow, and that question you see in the film is the question I asked him on the second interview. What do you think your responsibility is as a historian? Now, I'm glad you're asking me that question about my responsibility. My responsibility as a filmmaker in telling this story was to basically present Dr. King, warts and all. Okay, but let me articulate what that means. You know, I wanted to show him it's not just the minister who led the Montgomery bus boycott, who helped shape and create the SCLC, who was, you know, the moral leader of the country, as A. Philip Randolph says in the film with his March on Washington speech. But I want to show you as a man who also had a very complicated life. I mean, he's the head of the civil rights movement. He's dealing with the fact that he knows he's being monitored by the FBI 24/7. At the same time as his personal life obviously is very complicated. At the same time, he's getting a Nobel Peace Prize and he's probably feeling, why am I getting this? At the same time, by 1967, he decides he's going to come out against Vietnam, America being in Vietnam, knowing full well it was going to put a knife in the relationship between him and the Johnson administration, you know. But my responsibility as a filmmaker is to try to show you all those things, but to be respectful and to try to be, and I'll use this word very delicately, I was trying to be as even-handed as possible, you know. So even in dealing with the rape allegations, which we felt we couldn't shy away from, we tried to present it in a way that wasn't a gotcha moment, you know. We tried to present it the way that, you know, who knows exactly what was going on in that room. The FBI is making these little footnotes in the margins, you know, basically suggesting this is what they think happened, you know. So that's how we tried to present it. And you know, I mean, some people will say, well, why do you have to air Dr. King's dirty laundry? Well, I don't think we really did. We just sort of tried to speak to it. And I think for me, as a filmmaker, that's my job and my responsibility, to speak to the things about people that sometimes are a little edgy, but I feel that you got to show because we're all human beings and none of us walk on water, not even Dr. King. As much as I revere Dr. King, Chris, he doesn't walk on water. Mm-hmm. And I was saying, I was saying to someone earlier today, in 1963, you know, I was 13 years old and Dr. King was revered in my household. In this household, like in many Black households around that time, Chris, there were 3 pictures we had on the wall: Martin Luther King, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. So that tells you what I thought about him, but I was 13. I'm not 13 anymore.
Right. Well, good that you mentioned Kennedy, because I wanted to get back to, you know, the first brush that the FBI, as you mentioned, is trying to paint King with is these communist connections. And, you know, I'd say it's you know, not just communist, but it's Stanley Levinson, a Jewish communist, you know, and this wasn't new. Throughout the early parts of the movement, there were issues with that were brought up, and there was surveillance of people like Bayard Rustin and so forth. In some ways, it seems like there's a bit of a paternalistic view that Black people couldn't just be doing this all by themselves, right? And that there must be this, something at work behind the scenes. And that's not, I think in one way in the film, you do a good job of presenting the power of Hoover and the power of the FBI and so forth, but it's not just, and there's certainly a lot to that of a very powerful, person like Hoover going through so many years in charge of the FBI and becoming somewhat of a demagogue who's not, as Beverly Gage and the other historians were saying.
Donna Murch
Says, yes, in the film, Hoover didn't just see himself as a law enforcement officer, but he saw himself as an enforcement of his idea of Americanness. But it's not just him. I mean, the Kennedys and later the Johnsons, are involved in this. It's not like it's solely the efforts of Hoover and the FBI. What would you say to that?
Well, I'm going to tell you this exactly right, because what is Hoover a stand-in for? He's a stand-in for white America. He's a demagogue, but he's not doing this sort of like, I'm just doing it because I want to do it. Part of that maybe, but he's also standing for an America, Chris. The 50s was the America of Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver, Mom and Apple Pie. And where were Black people? They were on the fringes. You were either a maid or a butler or a handyman, and then when you finished your job in a white man's house, you went back to your community. That was a self-contained community, and people didn't see you. You were in the shadows. So all of a sudden, here's a man basically standing up and saying, we don't want to be in the shadows anymore. And we can look at this America today, that frightened people. They said, oh my God, Black people want to be equal to us. I was watching this movie on Saturday, Chris, from 1942 called The Glass Key with Alan Ladd. And there's a scene in that movie with this young actress named Benita Granville. And he's taking her back to her apartment, and he's telling her that she shouldn't be hanging out with these unsavory characters in the gambling world. And she says to him, Chris, you can't tell me what to do because I'm free, white, and 21. You remember that phrase, right?
Yeah, sure.
That was the phrase, We're the white people. We can do anything. And Black people can't do that, because they're not free, and they're not white, So Hoover's basically a stand-in for America. So John Kennedy, as you know, as an historian, he wasn't so gung-ho about the civil rights movement. He had to be pulled into it, He had to be, said, this is something that's important for the country, President Kennedy. And then when Hoover says to Bobby and John Kennedy, we've learned that Dr. King is associating with a known former communist, Stanley Levinson, who has a relationship, and check this out, he has a relationship with two brothers, Morris and Jack Childs, who had been communists since the 30s and 40s. And then they had sort of been disenchanted with the Communist Party, and they became personal informants for the FBI. They were double agents. They were like Frank Lovejoy, and I was a communist for the FBI. But they knew Levinson. And some people still say, even though when Levinson left the Communist Party, they thought that Levinson still was a communist. So when he became a close associate of Dr. King, how could Black people on their own, as you just said, want to be communists without a little push? So the Kennedys basically called Dr. King into the White House and say, we got all this material about your relationship with Stanley Levinson. You're about to have the march in Washington. I think you need to separate yourself from those who have communist connections and leanings. And it was not only, as you know this, Chris, it was not only Levinson, but it was Bayard and other members, And the thing that I find fascinating is that Martin Luther King bold-faced lie to the Kennedys. He says, you're absolutely right. I'm going to disassociate myself from Stanley Levinson. Does he ever do it? No. No.
Right. Well, and as you say, Kennedy, both President Kennedy and Attorney General Kennedy, they're very much looking to get done with civil rights, to sort of put it on the side. They have bigger fish to fry with the Cold War and so forth, and they don't want to come out against it, but they want some way for it to go away. So we see the deals that they make with the South, with the freedom rides and other things like that, so that it's, so you could imagine that, well, that these ideas of painting him as a communist allow them to sort of sidestep it without coming out against civil rights. Let me ask one more question, and we're going to bring Larry in. And I was looking at your interview with our friend Tom Powers when this film debuted at the Toronto International Film Festival this September, and he asked, at that moment, we were early on in our battles with coronavirus. We were seeing protests following George Floyd and the other events of 2020 that made it such an iconic year. And he asked you, how do you feel that this film speaks to our current times? Well, now 6 months later, we've had, as you mentioned, we've seen the protest, the attack on our Capitol by this mob that ran over the gates and infiltrated the Capitol. How do you see this film speaking to current times, when now we're seeing the FBI needing to at the last minute sort of go back and start to intelligence work about some of these far right groups and others who are attacking the nation, in this way, and seeing those threats? What are you seeing 6 months later?
Here's what I'm saying. I mean, I think it's complicated. First of all, the FBI sometimes is always a little late coming to the table. Remember, we had to twist their arms to investigate the murders of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman. They had to have their feet put to the fire when King was assassinated to really track down who was the assassin. Now, and I know some people think the FBI were part of the conspiracy to kill King. And so that's one thing. So them coming late to the table after what happened on January 6th doesn't surprise me. I mean, they had all this technology and they have all this information, and they still couldn't basically figure out, we need to have force out there to stop this. That's number one. Number two, Chris, what I saw when the people attacked the Capitol building, to me, was not an anomaly. It spoke volumes to American history and who Americans can be when they want to be. So for example, Chris, attacking the Capitol building to basically try to stop the electoral vote speaks to me of white people basically going into Black communities like Tulsa, like Rosewood and others, in the 20s, basically when they felt they weren't happy with what was happening in Black communities, they didn't like the success happening in Black communities, they found something that could light a match. A Black man touched a white woman, a little boy was knocked down by a Black man. They had a match, it was lit, and they would then go into these communities and destroy them, much like you saw on January 6th. They would bomb them, they would burn them down, they would kill people. So to me, it just speaks volumes to America. The other thing too, the thing that one of the reasons that this film also resonates so much, Chris, is, think of it this way. Dr. King is on a talk show in the film, and this journalist, this white female journalist, she asked questions of Dr. King. Why do you feel don't you feel your peaceful protesters are causing the riots in the cities? All of a sudden, it made me flash forward to someone saying, don't you feel the Black Lives Matter movement is causing these riots in the cities? Then the other thing, don't you feel that, social communism and Black people are going to destroy the nation? Fast forward, Chris, don't you feel that if you let these socialist Democrats get elected, they will destroy our suburbs and our communities? I mean, it's like deja vu. Mm-hmm. It's like deja vu. You're hearing the same thing again. So Americans need to read their history books. They need to watch films like this. Not that all of them are going to believe it, because the misinformation is so rampant now. And people are so stuck in their silos, they won't believe anything.
All right, thank you, Sam. Don't go away. We're gonna switch gears and bring in Larry Rubin. I know we have a lot of questions from the audience for you, so we'll be back to you in just a bit. I want to bring in, thank you again, Sam, and we'll see you in a second. I want to bring in Larry Rubin.
Want me to go off screen, Chris?
Yes, you can go off screen, and then we'll have Larry open up your camera and bring Larry on screen. Welcome, Larry. Thank you so much for being here today. Let me
Chris,
tell the audience a little bit about you.
I want to thank you very much for inviting me on. It means a lot to me to be part of the fulfillment of Bernice Johnson Reagan's dream. You know, I worked with her when she was a student at Albany State, and it touches my heart to be part of a program that she started. So thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you, Larry. I want to tell you a little bit about you for our audience. So Larry Rubin was a student nonviolent community coordinating committee organizer in Southwest Georgia and northern Mississippi, working to support Black Southerners who were risking their lives to exercise their right to vote. Larry felt if African Americans in the South could vote, then they could vote out of office the white supremacist, anti-Semitic, anti-union congressmen and senators who controlled the US government at the time. It's a quote from Larry. Aside from voter registration work as part of the North Mississippi project in the mid 60s, early 60s, Larry helped organize a union at a brick-making factory in Holly Springs, Mississippi in 1964, helped organize precincts of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and helped sharecroppers exercise their right to vote in county elections that determined benefits for farmers. Larry is currently an officer of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's Legacy Project, and after the work in the 60s, he stayed involved in the labor movement as an organizer, political advocate, and communications director, as well as working as a reporter for the Dayton Daily News, a speechwriter for the United States Department of Education, and served 4 terms on the Tacoma Park, Maryland City Council. So thank you so much for your life of work for the betterment of the nation. Let's, as we talked about with Sam and saw in the film, there was this effort starting really in 1962 of the FBI to really bring down King, and it went a bit farther back than that with some other people in the movement. Tell us about you as again a 22-year-old. You were working for the Mississippi Freedom. The Mississippi Summer Project, also known as Freedom Summer, to develop schools, freedom schools in Mississippi, and we're at the organizing and training program at Oberlin, Ohio, at Oxford, Ohio, for that work. Can you tell us a little bit about what you were working on and what Freedom Summer was?
I will. I want to make 2 points before I answer your question. One is that the idea of spreading rumors about somebody's personal life, extramarital relations, was absolutely not a new tactic. Everybody that stood up in the South, especially women, for example, the 2 women that preceded Rosa Parks in Montgomery, got smeared. There are rumors about their personal life. So that was an old tactic. And number 2, this thing of calling you a communist. Fannie Lou Hamer said that if they ain't calling you a communist, they ain't doing anything worthwhile. That's without examining, what does that mean, being a communist? You know what? For me, they didn't even say I was a communist. They said, as you see on the screen, civil rights worker has communist background. what does that mean? Communist background. And why is that relevant to anything whatsoever? The point being that the segregationists try to divert the issue from we are not a nation of equals to something about communists. Today, as Sam pointed out, this argument by ad hominem attack continues. Today, Trump doesn't even call you a communist. He says, you're a Democrat. That's bad enough. You know, you question his response to COVID-19. You're doing it because you're a Democrat. But he doesn't deal with the subject of COVID-19. Now, to get back to your question, I was sent from Southwest Georgia by Jim Foreman to help set up. Oh, and on the screen now, I'll just point out before I get back to my point. I don't know if you can go up a little bit higher, but when I was red baited, and I'll get into that story in a minute, it was for a purpose. The issue at the time was what happened to the 3 civil rights workers? They disappeared. Their bodies had not been found. Well, we knew that they had been killed, and the FBI was dragging their feet and dragging rivers where they know they were not. And Senator Eastland was trying to spread the idea that it was a hoax. And he said, you're laughing it up on Moscow Gold, there was a bunch of communists, in a New York hotel room. That is, they're being controlled by Jews. And he put not that exact quote, but similar information into the congressional record, which this is shown above. So the red baiting, this ad hominem attack, was for a purpose, was to divert the attention, particularly of people in Mississippi, whites, and hopefully blacks, but that didn't work, from talking about what happened to the civil rights workers to, they're a bunch of communists. Anyway, to get back to
let's talk about that. So you're in Oxford, Ohio, and you're heading down to Mississippi to set up these schools to deal with the fact that despite the Supreme Court ruling in 1954 to make schools equal and not separate, that hasn't happened in Mississippi. So the part of the Freedom Summer Project was to set up schools to educate not just children, but even adults in Mississippi. And so you're headed down there. I think you've told the story before, and you felt like they knew you were coming because you crossed the